DWP.
Accounts Committee on Monday the 21st of May 2018. We're here today to do a couple of things. One is to welcome shortly, after our first panel, the new Permanent Secretary at the DWP to his first hearing as Permanent Secretary. I'm sure he's thrilled. He was been in post since January, so this is his first time in front of us when he does appear in a moment. And also to look at a National Audit Office report on errors in the Employment and Support Allowance and how that's been administered, and has left a large number of people, 70,000, or an estimated 70,000 people owed money in unpaid benefits. This report that the NEO has done is a reminder that when the department makes errors, it has a big impact. Something that as a committee we highlight, and as MPs we see very much at our surgery. And the average underpayment for each person affected, just going back to 2014, and there's argument about how far we go back on that, is around £5,000, but in some cases more. So it's significant for those people involved, but there are wider issues about how the DWP is working and how it can deal with this sort of error when it arises, and we'll be asking the Permanent Secretary about that shortly, as well as, I warn him now, a range of other issues that are on the agenda. I'm sure he's fully prepared for all of that. So I want to introduce our first panel. We've got Daphne Hall, who's the Vice Chair of the National Association of Welfare Rights Advisors, which actually was the body that first started picking up some of these issues. Is that right?
It was RightsNet, which is separate. I work for RightsNet, but I'm also the Vice Chair, so it was the website, the discussion forum on the website which picked it up.
So but website with your members are very active.
All members are active on it, yes.
Right, thanks for the clarification, that's important. And then Jeff Fimister, who's the Policy Co-Chair for the Disability Benefits Consortium. So thank you very much for coming, because one of the things we wanted to do was just get a flavour of, one, how this ESA issue has affected people on the front line, but before we finish, we would like you also just to give us any other concerns you've got or issues you think we should be raising with the department. So we will do that as well. So first of all, on the issue of the ESA, perhaps Daphne Hall, as it came through some of your members, what happened? Can you just talk us through how people first noticed this and began to realise that there was a trend coming through?
It was probably sort of 2013, 2014. The thread started in 2014. So advisors had been seeing people come in. They weren't coming in because they were getting the wrong level of benefit, because they didn't know. And it has to be said, the standard of the DWP letters was shocking. I mean, even as an advisor, trying to make head or tail of what you were on and why was really difficult. So people were seeing it and just dealing with clients on an individual basis. But then there were just too many of them, and I'm going, something's going wrong here. And at the first posting was someone saying, I'm seeing loads of these. Is anybody else? Wondering whether it was a local issue. And then within 24 hours, it come in from all over the country, Scotland, Wales, other places in England, that we're all seeing the same. And so I think probably that's that beginning of 2014 when I think advisors realised it was systemic, and that's when we started to sort of contacting, other than just dealing with individual cases, to try and escalate it to a more national level. And the first letter went off, it was in July 2014, to Caxton House, to sort of try and bring it up at national level. That was it was from an individual advisor in Derbyshire, actually, who is a NORA member, but he just took it upon himself to write the letter and shared it on the thread so that people could see what was going on.
Uncovered this effectively.
He's basically the one that started it off. I should give him his credit.
A lot of people wanting to give him a pat on the back or buy him a pint or whatever.
Yes, he's owed a pint for sure, definitely.
Okay. Jeff Fimister, I mean, well, I don't know whether your advisors were picking up this issue as well at that same time. How has it affected, though, the sort of people that your organisation is supporting?
Well, the Disability Benefits Consortium represents more than 80 individual organisations across the range of disabilities. So for DBC members, obviously Employment and Support Allowance is an issue which will affect a significant proportion of their clientele to one degree or another, whether that's in the support group or the work-related activity group. And clearly the transition from the earlier benefits to ESA has been something which we've all been interested in, and picked up on cases where it's gone wrong in the same kind of way as Daphne describes. It's something which is common to the advice sector in general.
So since this has been uncovered, obviously there have been some actions by the department, but now you've got people that you're advising who are aware that they've lost the money, or are they yet? Because obviously it's going through the department bit by bit. There's 70,000 people.
Yeah, I mean, there'll be lots of people out there who don't know. The bit I forgot to say before, actually, was when they were coming in, a lot of people were coming in because they'd had fines from the NHS Business Authority, because they'd claimed free prescriptions or free dental treatment, but because they were only on the contributory benefit. So that's how a lot of the cases came to advisors, and the advisors did a check and then realised. It's difficult to know. I mean, there were still cases coming up where people didn't know. They haven't seen the press. I mean, I know it's been in the press, but a lot of the people who are affected by it perhaps won't have realised the impact. I can imagine there's thousands and thousands out there who don't actually know yet that what's going on and what's happening. And certainly when the DWP did their pilot of contacting people, the pilot of this trawl they're now started, initially they were phoning people cold, which was a bit difficult. They are now doing a letter first, but a lot of people didn't know what that was about. So I think there were people there who don't know.
So do you know of people who've actually had to pay out for, who don't yet know but may have paid out other costs, like for their dental treatment?
Well, I think I couldn't point to specific research on this particular issue, but generally speaking, where people are living below the level they should be living at, these are quite large amounts of money relative to low incomes that people experience on benefit. And whenever in the benefits world you do a benefit take-up campaign and you find people not claiming benefits that they should be claiming, or if you're doing debt advice and you're trying to maximise their incomes and enable them better to cope with outgoings, you constantly come across that scenario where difficulties of all kinds with paying bills and dealing with outgoings result from being on an income level lower than you should be on. That's absolutely common experience.
Okay. Jamana Mahmood, do you want to come in?
What's your general experience of when you see issues arising at the benefit system and you try and communicate with the DWP? What's your perception of their attitude towards people like yourselves and vulnerable claimants when they're raising issues with the system?
Talking on an individual level, or when we do like sort of more national liaison?
A little bit of both, actually, but more on the national liaison of a big issue like this.
Do you want to go first or shall
I can give you very, very live examples here. I found I've dealt with the DWP and its predecessors for many, many years, and I always find officials on the whole, as individuals, cooperative and amiable. But I do feel there's a kind of a lack of a sense of an institutional sense of urgency where something actually does go wrong. I'm a consultant to the Thomas Pocklington Trust in the visual impairment field, and we do a lot of work jointly with the Royal National Institute of Blind People as well. And at the moment we have two issues on the go with personal independence payment, where we have two sets of guidance which we think are incorrect. We think they don't fit the legislation or the case law, and we think that sooner or later claimants are going to have to be identified and it's going to have to be sorted out. In one of these instances, it appears that independent assessment services have actually devised the guidance themselves without the department's knowledge, which I think is worrying in terms of the contract management. But anyway, we have those two sets of guidance likely to cause a need for retrospective payments. And we finally have a meeting with officials later this week to discuss these two issues, and that's some 4 months after we first drew it to officials' attention. And while that's going on, more and more cases are being wrongly decided and will have to be identified. I was going to say, to be fair to the DWP, they would say that they don't agree with us that this guidance is incorrect, but we think it is.
You said, I think, I wasn't sure I've heard right, that some of the assessment centres had devised the procedure themselves, was it?
This is PIP Activity 6, which is Daily Living Activity 6, which concerns help with dressing. And Thomas Pocklington Trust started getting reports initially from the North West that claimants were not being awarded points for needing help with dressing. And we, to cut a long story short, discovered that there was guidance which said that visual impairment in itself was not sufficient to score points. Now that just isn't right, so we probed that. We got hold of documentation from independent assessment services quoting the guidance, which they said was DWP guidance, in some detail. Departments initially wouldn't acknowledge the guidance existed. They eventually did decide that it existed, but said that it had been developed by IAS without their knowledge, and that shouldn't have happened. But they say it's an isolated occurrence, but we don't know how many advisors, how many assessors actually receive this guidance and how many cases are affected. That's what we're going to be talking to the department about later this week. But nevertheless, the guidance exists, it's out there, it's being used to make wrong decisions.
Siobhan Mahmood and then Caroline.
I was interested, you said lack of institutional urgency, which I thought was quite a nice way of putting it. Do you think that is more pronounced when we're dealing with cases where particularly the most vulnerable claimants have been underpaid as opposed to where overpayments occur in the system?
Yes.
Please.
No, well, I think that's a really pertinent point. Yes, if somebody's been overpaid, the letters come like this. Your question, I mean, going back to your initial question, it's a real mixed thing. I represent Nora and RightsNet on the state operational stakeholders, the national sort of meetings with sort of staff, and it's a real mixed bunch. I have to say there's some people there who are really, really good and are really fighting hard to try and sort things out, will bring things to their attention. Sometimes they then hit a brick wall within the bureaucracy of the DWP, so they're trying to do it and they can't make the changes. And if I can just give another example of one where we're fighting at the moment, it's where people are moving from ESA to universal credit, what they call natural migration, because of a change of the circumstances, typically moved house or something. They move on to universal credit. They get the extra bit they get in the ESA because they've got limited capability for work or work-related activity. That should automatically be transferred over into their universal credit, and it hasn't been. At the beginning, it wasn't happening at all. It has been improved, but it's done clerically. It's like it involves the decision maker filling in a form and sending it off to ESA and getting it back, and lots are slipping through the net. We raised it over and over with stakeholders. I think 4 months isn't too bad because we've been raising this well over a year now. Really wants the thing. Raised it stakeholders. Eventually, Nora wrote to David Gork, who was the then Secretary of State, in approximately October, November, who passed it on to Neil Cooling, and we had a range of letters going.
Neil Cooling is the
Director General of Universal Credit. Sorry.
Yeah,
we had a bit of correspondence, which I'm sorry to say, ended with Neil Cooling accusing Nora of scaremongering by raising the issue, and which I thought was completely inappropriate. We hadn't taken it to the press, we hadn't tweeted about it. We'd just written to him to say we're concerned this is an issue, it needs resolving. That's what we're there for, to try and sort things out, not to make things difficult. And he basically cut us blank, just blanked us. Didn't want to know, and I found that really unconstructive.
You said, sorry.
I was going to say, if I might just add to that, my feeling is it's essentially you can see why the DWP would be reluctant to concede that there was a systemic problem, which then requires a trawl, because those trawls are very resource consuming and take time, and staff have to be diverted from other things. So I can see why there's a reluctance to concede that. The problem with that means that the thing spins out before it finally is conceded, and then it's a bigger problem.
It becomes a much bigger task later on. I just want to come back to what you said, Ms Hall, about some people in the system, frontline staff, wanting to make changes and sort of hitting a brick wall. Do they express to you the reasons why that happens?
I didn't quite get that.
I think you said that some people within the DWP try to make changes, the people that engage with you most closely.
For example, through the stakeholders forum, we have some very good contacts in Universal Credit, and we can just email them. They email us as to ask things. They can get things sorted sometimes just like that. They'll really make their best effort to do it. But sometimes they hit a brick wall when they're trying to get things changed. For example, this UC to the ESA to UC, I know they were trying, but it wasn't progressing. So I'm not saying that the DWP don't want to try and resolve that. I think they do, but sometimes they don't listen. When we're trying to raise things. So that's what it feels like. We're raising it over and over. And as I say, we've got evidence that shows that things are wrong. I often send them a thread from the forum because that they can see then what's happening and that it's happening all over, and they really appreciate that. But yeah, just sometimes getting the ball rolling and making the changes. Sometimes it seems like things that could be done quite simply. I mean, maybe I don't understand it. You think there'd be tweaks that they could do. We suggested, training or guidance going out, and sometimes it's just hard to make things happen.
Back to Ms Mood later if we've got time. Ms Finn.
DWP is probably one of those few government departments that can command and control from the centre. It seems to me, having been a former Employment and Welfare Minister. What do you think, in terms of looking forward, should change in the way, look, benefits do change over time, we know that, and they have to be fit for purpose for the age we live in. But what lessons do you think there are from this to improve, trying to get certainty before something is delivered on the ground, to make sure things are better and people understand what they're meant to be doing? What changes would you like to see?
I think a greater sensitivity to what's happening on the ground, that in issues that may be systemic, that may cause a problem. There needs to be a better upward flow of information from the front line, as it were, and also when people such as the agencies that I'm representing and that Daphne's representing, when we raise things, they should always be taken seriously, because these are, on the whole, pretty skillful welfare rights advisors, and they don't raise things for the fun of it. So it's a question of escalating upwards to a more senior level more quickly. And I think reading the NAO report, I think that's been conceded by the department, but I think that would certainly help.
Sorry, do you want to add to that?
Pretty much the same thing. Right. Communication, I think, just about listening and communicating back. If they need more information, we're there. We want to get it resolved as quickly and as easily as possible. And
who should the department section be that should be the sort of, where you can go to and know you're going to get a response?
Forum is what it's there for. We have 3 monthly meetings, but we can email them in between, and I'm regularly emailing. And as I say, some things do. So it's not that nothing gets resolved, and I don't want to create that impression. So it can work, but sometimes it seems to hit a brick wall. And so I don't know whether that's more within the DWP. We raise it, we get it there, and it's what happens after that. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. So it's difficult for us to know always why it is and why it isn't. There are definitely some people who are more open to suggestions than others, I think, but I guess that's just always the way.
There are several stakeholder forums of one kind and another, and they could certainly be a vehicle for that sort of communication. But there's also communication with the DWP's own frontline staff, because in my experience they're often quite knowledgeable and they pick things up themselves, so there's a channel needs developing there.
And even the unions, the PCS, they sometimes raise issues if things are coming up as well.
I don't want to too much paraphrase you. There is actually a structure there that could be used. Information is fed through that.
Yeah.
It just in this particular situation, it was just not acted upon.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair.
And that's exactly what's happened with the examples with PIP that I gave. We raised it with the PIP stakeholder forum about, as I say, 4 months ago, and we're only just getting a meeting.
Well, so the UC one's going over a year and it's still not sorted. And, this is people being underpaid again. Same sort of thing.
I represent the National Star College that takes some of our most severely less able youngsters, get some independent living and independent work, if possible. The errors in this allowance would in some cases have caused some very severe cases of hardship. How sympathetically and urgently are the DWP now treating these cases?
Well, I can give you a case study from someone so they've spotted it in January this year that they've been underpaid. It took them, I think it was 8 or 9 phone calls and a complaint, and it finally got paid at the beginning of March. And the client was suicidal by then. This is and interestingly, they backdated it in full to prior to October 2014, which is what they have been doing for all the cases. Virtually all the cases up until 2017 were backdated in full because they knew it was an official error, and then suddenly they found this court case, and well, we'll come back to that maybe.
So has your workload, both of you? Has it increased? Have the number of cases increased lately? Because of the recognition by the department, now they know that they're entitled to it. Has your workload increased?
It's a bit early days for that because the trawl only started at the beginning of April. So I think up until April, it's just cases that were coming to advisors' attention as and when. Now that the letters are going out, I think it was the beginning of April the letters started going out. So I don't know whether you've picked up yet. I haven't really picked up whether that, I guess people will be going in with their ESA 3 forms, which is the form they have to fill in, and that might increase things, but it's just a little bit early at the moment to know.
People coming in asking if they are affected, even if they haven't had a letter.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the answer.
I think in the general experience in the disability field is that the advice services are at full stretch anyway, because there has been an increase in problems with the standard of decision making in both PIP and ESA, and the Work and Pensions Committee, of course, done a lot of work on that. So whether we would be seeing an increase or not is hard to say, given the pressure that's there anyway. One of the things that concerns me is that we were talking about arrears before. I think most claimants probably wouldn't know there was something wrong with their arrears payments. They wouldn't be familiar with this. I'd certainly endorse the point that we would regard this as official error and it should be fully backdated.
And in fact,
Matter of a legal dispute at the moment, which we will raise certainly with the Permanent Secretary. Anne-Marie Morris.
It seems to be a very clunky system. Whenever the government decides to move to a different benefit system, there are almost artificial timelines and deadlines put into this, which simply doesn't seem to work. And I'm not entirely clear why. If you understand why, I'd love the clarity. I suppose, second question, what happens to somebody who goes through the work capability assessment and they don't get into the RAG group or a group that would give them ESA? They then appeal, and on appeal, it's then found that actually they would be in a group that would entitle them. Do they get lost in the system, or have they been time barred from then going after what they are entitled to under ESA?
If it was a new claim for ESA, it wouldn't be relevant. So you're thinking maybe somebody who's on ESA gets called in for the work capability assessment. No, it should be fine, because as I understand it with the trawl, they're looking at every case that migrated from incapacity benefit between the beginning of 2011 and the end of 2014, regardless of what happened to them after that. So it's the point of migration that's the key point. So anyone, whether they've stopped being on benefit, they've got better, whether they've died, whatever it is, as I understand it, and we've had some meetings with them, the trawl should pick up everybody, or if they've moved on to universal credit. If they were migrated from incapacity benefit to ESA, they should be okay and get picked up, I think.
Final question from me. We're looking at a very serious error here, which has disadvantaged many people very seriously and very significantly. The focus now is to get them the money that was owed to them. Should there be a separate issue about maladministration for what they've actually, if you like, suffered, because their lives have been fundamentally changed? There is a financial cost to that. And is that something that any of your, if you like, individuals...
In our report, one of our recommendations was not only should they backdate in full, because it was an official error, they told the NAO that in April 2014 they knew it was an official error then. So they cannot really then say that this legal case 6 months later established the legislative thing. They already knew how the legislation was interpreted. That was just a standard UT decision, upper tribunal decision, saying that they got the thing wrong. It wasn't a test case. It was just another upper tribunal decision. So one, they should get backdated in full, they should get all the money back. But yes, one of our other recommendations was there should be financial redress, and there's a policy for that. I mean, these people, it's a means-tested benefit, which, as we know, is the bare minimum the government thinks you need to live off. These people, some of these people were in at 2/3 of their correct rate of money. And these disability premiums that they were missing out on, they're there to meet the extra cost of disability, maybe extra heating, maybe taxis so they're not so isolated, maybe a special diet, could be any number of things. And these people were living for years, some of them, without that money. I mean, it's incomprehensible what it would have done to their lives.
I mean, the compensation thing is always interesting because it can take a lot to prove through trawling through old paperwork what you could get. Have you suggested a formula for compensation? Is that something, or Mr. Vetwell?
I think the priority is to do the backdating, but then the compensation. Well, but yeah,
well,
you go.
I think we haven't come up with a formula, but I think when the dust settles of the various legal challenges that are on the go at the moment, if the 21st of October 2014 limit stands at the end of that, which I hope it won't, but if it does, then I think there's a very strong moral case for the DWP to compensate claimants anyway, going back before that for the amount, because they'll know how much, I understand the DWP will know how much has been truncated by the limit.
Yeah. Well, it's food for thought. The Employment Secretary's here listening. Did you have, Anne-Marie Morris, anything else?
I guess it would be quite interesting to know with regard to these additional payments, and to the Chair's question, is there any way that you could assess it? Clearly, when the government says there's this much owing, it's not taken account of any of that. If you did try to take account of that, do you think we're looking at doubling the sorts of figures? Have you quantified quite a lot of the processes?
I'm not a compensation expert, I wouldn't know.
Any ballpark? Anyone done any ballpark work on this at all?
If we're talking about the scenario where compensation was designed to, as I say, if the October 2014 limit stood, then in each individual case the DWP will know how much has been lost before that date, and at the very least there will be a case for compensating people to the equivalence of that loss.
Is that included in figures that are in this report? Or is that
yes,
just...
the gross cost is, but my understanding is that also in individual cases the DWP will have that information.
That's the challenge. There will be very many individual cases.
They did say, having done the trawl, if the legal case is successful and they do backdating, they will have all the information to pay everybody. They won't have to do a second trawl. They'll have the information there to pay out. So, as Jeff says, they've got that information.
But suddenly the flurry of members, so we're going to have a quick fire from Luke Graham, Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Karen Flint, and then Siobhan.
Very quick question. Acknowledging the kind of passporting rights of the ESA, do you know to the extent to which some of the claimants have missed out on other benefits because they've been cut short on ESA? Do you have any idea of the scale of that problem or the extent?
Quantify it, can we? I mean, it's all the standard passporting things like the dental costs, free school meals, access to budgeting loans, but I think it's virtually impossible to quantify what people couldn't get.
I know of no evidence that would enable us to quantify that, but it has been a matter of concern to advice agencies that the trawl, in fact, doesn't take that into account.
The trawl doesn't cover that. Okay.
No, because it's the prescription stuff is NHS Business Authority, so it's completely they don't have that information. Wow. And of course, if somebody doesn't apply for a budgeting loan, you can't quantify it.
Wow. I can see the ambulance chasing lot getting into this as well, potentially. Siobhan Mahmood.
Just wanted, just on section 27 and ongoing legal challenge, what's your sense of the extent to which claims have been paid and backdated in full, so to the date of migration, even post that ruling? I know you said that you just had a case.
Yes, it's 2018, and there were lots in 2017. In our report, I don't know if you saw, there were some charts, because I just basically asked that when was the backdating to, and by far the majority, I think it was around about 70%, they were backdated all the way. Sometimes with a bit of a fight, but sometimes very easily, it just depended. So I'm just trying to see if I can see the graph in front of me. Yeah, so, yeah, it was almost, about 65% got it all the way back to the date of migration, and it would be the more recent cases that didn't. There's somewhere on the thread, there's someone on the DWP, they're ringing up the DWP, and the person there says, they've realised there's a lot of these cases, we're now limiting the backdating, they've put an amendment in. And I think that was probably round about the sort of 2016, 2017 time when they were looking for something to let them off the hook a bit, is my view. I do think if a claimant, somebody raises before, a claimant gets overpaid, they come straight at you. If it's their fault, they have to pay it all, even if it was done completely innocently, and they can have a civil penalty on top. And that's what happens to the claimant. And here we've got these people, severely disabled. By the nature of the fact they're in the support group, a lot of them, then they're not likely to get back to work. The DWP have assessed them as that, and they're trying to limit money they were legally entitled to.
From that, of course, there's a large number of people, 70,000, to go through this process. Are you able to help influence whether most of the most vulnerable get dealt with earlier in the queue, or you have no...
The trouble is, if people just try and do it, that there's, as I'm picking up from advisors, that if you try and sort of jump the queue and get in there first, they sort of say, we're doing it in our own. They go off to Oldham.
Arguments both ways.
Yeah, it's difficult because, do you try and push it through?
But if somebody's really struggling because they are not...
Advisors are trying to do it so that what happens now is if you pick one up, it gets sent... There may be some other centres, but Oldham is certainly one of them. I think there were 4 centres. And then it's a matter of how much you phone them, I think, and pester them. You might get it pushed through quicker. But yeah, then somebody else gets moved down. It's really difficult. It's going to take a full year to do. It's a long time. Yeah. And then, and some of these people will still not be on the right money while they're waiting for that.
Okay. So while you're here, and we've got the Permanent Secretary in the room, and we're about to ask him questions, what are the other issues you think that need particular attention, or that we or our sister committee, the DWP Select Committee, should be highlighting with the DWP in terms of the service that your clients are getting? I
think particularly this movement of people from ESA onto universal credit. I think that's it is not as bad as it was. There are some improvements, but people are still slipping through the net, and yeah, it's just engaging with us and talking to us about it would be really
help, is what you're saying.
Yes. Mr. Cooling would like to come back
a
to
smile
me.
from the Permanent Secretary at that point. That's good. Jeff for Mr.
Mine would be the recommendation both by Paul Gray's independent review of PIP and also the Work and Pensions Committee's examination of ESA and PIP. The recommendation that assessment reports should automatically be available to claimants. I think if that was to happen, that would have a behavioural effect on the quality of the assessments, and that would be a big step forward and quite a simple thing to do.
We probably could go on for longer, but
we're all for openness on this committee, though I can't speak for the committee, but I hear what you're saying. Well, I mean, thank you very much indeed. It's very helpful to hear from you, and it does make it really live, as you say, some very vulnerable people affected by this, and now waiting potentially up to a year to get their money back, and then in one big lump, which has its own challenges. Will that affect anyone's entitlement to other benefits?
That just reminded me of the point I wanted to say. If the DWP will accept that it is official error, as it is, then there's a legislative, I can't remember the exact one, but there's a legislation that says any capital is disregarded for as long as you remain entitled to that benefit, whereas the standard one is just for 52 weeks. So obviously there's people with those £20,000 sums, and then it's very important to have that disregarded. So that's another really important thing to establishing the official
error. That's when clerical error is agreed.
If you get official error, yes. If they accept that it's official error, then it gets to... sorry, if it's over £5,000, it gets that same. But that's the key amount, really, because it's at 6,000, your benefit starts to get affected. Do
you have anything to add to that, Mr. Minister?
Sorry?
Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with it.
Well, it's great to have to... That's all it. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. The transcript of this and the rest of the hearing will be up on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. So do have a look in case you'd be... Our colleagues at Hansard are excellent, so I don't think you'll have any problems. But please look at that, and do feel free to stay for the second half of the session if you wish. And thank you very much for coming in today. And if we could call our second panel forward, please. Thank you. Okay, welcome. Everyone's settled. Good. Welcome to our second panel of witnesses. I won't repeat what I said before, except to welcome Peter Schofield in particular, who's the Permanent Secretary in the centre of this panel and has been at the Department for Work and Pensions since January, and you've managed to avoid a hearing in front of us since then. So this will be the first of many times spent together. So we're looking forward to it. I'm sure you are too. We were particularly keen to cover a number of issues as well as the substance of the National Audit Office report. I should also welcome the other witnesses from my left to right. James Wolfe, who's the Director for Disability, Employment and Support at the Department for Work and Pensions, and Emma Haddad, who's the Director for Working Age Benefits at the Department for Work and Pensions. I think, Ms Haddad, you've been in front of us before, am I right? Have you been?
Not the PSC, other select committees, though.
Yeah, forgive me. It's just good to have a woman from the department in front of us, so welcome to you. Before we move on to, we want to talk a little bit about universal credit, as you might expect. But before we do that, I just wanted to pick up on this issue raised by our sister committees, the DWP and Treasury Select Committees. We've obviously all been following the Motability issues, the excessive pay and the challenges there. They've come out with their report today, very timely. The Motability is obviously a charity, so in their hearing, Frank Field, the chair of the DWP Select Committee, asked if they would open up their books to the National Audit Office. Although we understand there are some negotiations underway, the National Audit Office have not received yet formal notification of this. Could you just update us, Mr. Schofield, on where that's at?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, it's great to be here, and thank you very much for your welcome. Well, that's me at the end. So you asked about Motability. So we now have seen a letter from the chair of Motability, Lord Sterling, to the chairs of the committees, as you say. I'm really glad to say that the chair has now agreed that for the purposes of, I think it's Section 6 of the National Audit Act, that Motability can now go on that list of bodies that the National Audit Office can review for value for money purposes. So I'm delighted we got to that point. I think now, formally, it is for the Controller and Auditor General to agree to take forward a value for money study. So I very much hope that...
And how long will that permission run for? Is that a permanent arrangement?
I think it's around 3 years. I think it can be done on that basis. And I think our intention is that this is very much for value for money purposes, not that the Controller and Auditor General becomes a formal auditor of Motability. I think you'll be relieved for that. But it's very much to do exactly as you said, Chair, to enable the National Audit Office to look at whether the unique status that Motability has is leading through to the sort of benefits that we want to go to claimants, actually materialising the full kind of effect of having a lower credit rating from the formality and the clarity of the way the payments are directed.
Your demeanour that you're perfectly happy with this arrangement, is that a fair assessment?
Look, I mean, our Secretary of State wrote to begin with asking for this to happen. So we're very pleased that this is going to happen now, subject obviously to Sir Amos's willingness to do this. And look forward to seeing what conclusions are raised by the National Audit Office review.
Sir Amos, then, what are you now going to do? This letter's winging its way to you, Sir Amos, as Controller and Auditor General. Are you able to share with us your plans about what you're now going to do with Motability?
I'll offer a few thoughts. One of them is, of course, I haven't received it yet, so I will certainly answer when I do. But assuming it's in line with what I've been led to expect, of course we'll accept to do some work. And what we'll try and do is to understand the major elements in the Motability operation, because you can't pick and choose really unless you can see it all fairly clearly and understand how it works, how the financing works, how all of that stuff works, and you know. And the reason you need to do that is if you're going to look at the pay levels, you need to look at, well, what are they being paid to do? What is it they're in charge of? All of that stuff. Is there good public value in the use of the mobility allowance or the assignation of mobility allowance? All of that. So what we're aiming to do is to travel around and do a pretty thorough job of understanding and produce a sort of accountant's report about all of that. I'm not disappointed to learn that I'm not being installed as a temporary financial auditor, but we'll try and do a really thorough job of understanding and with no preconceptions, obviously, as in all our work, no preconceptions about it whatsoever.
So, Miss, and we're all looking forward to seeing that, and I think hats off to the chair of the DWP Select Committee for pressing Motability in the hearing to offer up this. So it's taken a while to get here, but we are hopefully, once this letter arrives, in the right place. Universal credit, I'm going to ask Gillian Keegan just to get an update from you, Mr Schofield, on where things are at.
Yes, well, if you could start by just giving us an update on how the rollout of universal credit is going and maybe some data and stats as to how much is rolled out so far.
Yes, we are rolling out now. We slowed down the rollout to enable us to implement the budget changes. So that, if you recall, you know all about those. So those were put in place through January, February, and then the final one was put in place in April. We're now able to accelerate the rollout to job centres from that.
The 2-week extra
payment
for housing.
So that was the last one to go out. That was in April. We got rid of waiting days in February. I think it was the 14th of February. And then in the new year, the first one we introduced was extending the advances. So you can now get your full anticipated monthly entitlement as an advance, and you pay back over 12 months rather than 6. So all of those were put in place. That's the entirety of the £1.5 billion package that was announced by the Chancellor in November. So we slowed the rollout. I think we were only doing 10 job centres a month through that period. In May, we're doing 41. We're then increasing to 60 a month from June onwards, with the aim to have completed the rollout to all job centres by the end of 2018.
Stephen?
And do you have any, where you have rolled it out, do you have any data or figures on the take-up of alternative payment arrangements? So I think that's where people need to have some kind of a loan system or something to help them if they have a disconnect between the payment cycle and their rental cycle, for example.
In the housing element of universal credit. Yes, I mean, I don't have the data with me, but I can certainly write to the committee with further details. We are, as you know, currently discussing a report on universal credit with the National Audit Office anyway. So I'm anticipating quite a... I'm anticipating I'll be back, but I can certainly write to you in terms of the details.
Can you tell us, because when I think it might have been Neil Cooling who was in front of us before, was saying there was a very low percentage before, so that was available. Do you know if it's gone up or stayed static? Can you give us even a ballpark?
No, it's been going up. The key thing we've done is we've introduced this landlord portal, which we responded to quite a lot of stakeholder discussion in terms of things we could do to facilitate the whole process. So the landlord portal, and also introducing this concept of trusted landlords, it makes it much easier as a trusted partner. It makes it much easier where a landlord believes that a claimant who's moving from housing benefit into universal credit, for whatever their circumstances, should be paid, the housing element should be paid direct to the landlord. It makes it much easier for that whole process to work effectively.
So do you have any data on how many universal credit claimants are choosing that option? Is it a choice of that option? To get housing benefit paid directly, so cut themselves out?
Well, yeah, that's the thing you were asking for more detail on, Ms. Keegan, so I can certainly provide you with that. No, but it's a discussion. They can ask for that. It's also a discussion that landlords can raise as well. If they're a trusted partner, it makes it much easier for that whole process to work.
Okay, do you have a final business case now to proceed to the managed migration? Is that in place?
Yeah, so we've got a final business case agreed with the Treasury. And as I say, the National Audit Office have been looking through that final business case and are writing a report which we're currently discussing.
But that's finally agreed with the Treasury?
Yes.
Okay, and can you give us an update on split payments and the automation of split payments? Do you have a plan to automate split payments, split bank accounts?
Again, I can write to you on that. I don't know.
The Exec Committee got a bit of an update on this in the end of April, but wonder if there's any updates since then.
I don't think we've got any more updates on that, but if you like, I can write to you, or we can talk about it when Neil and I are back in.
Thank you. We'll make a judgment on that then. So, did you want to come into it? No. Sorry, Ms. Flint.
There's lots of people who are on ESA will be transferring over to universal credit. I know we're coming on to more detail, but what changes have you made for your learning from what we'll be discussing later on? Have you made any changes?
Yes, so
training, for example.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the point that the previous panel were making, we are absolutely aware of that, and there are a number of things we're doing in terms of training, in terms of looking in time to automate that process. I think the last panel, although they were concerned, I think they recognised, although I need to reread the transcript, I think they recognised that we were improving on this. This is an area that we need to make sure that as we roll out, we improve going forward.
This is very nicely to Mr. Mahmood.
Hello.
If we go right back to the beginning of the ESA rollout project, this was a pretty complicated process, migrating people from the much older benefits of IB and so on onto ESA. What assessment of the risks of that migration process did you identify, your department identify at the very point at which that process began? What were the risks you were aware of?
Obviously, the legislation was introduced, was passed in 2008. The work around the whole process of migrating was being done in 2010. And there was an independent review, there was a pilot, the Social Security Advisory Council committee looked at the whole process. We identified that this was going to be complex, but I think the whole process that we use is brilliantly set out, if I might say so, in this NEA report. It sets out in paragraph 2.3 the sort of consideration that we went through, the sort of process that we went through. And we put in place a process that at the time, we believe was the right one, consistent with the legislation.
And thank you for that, Mr. Schofield. And yet, this process seems to have been flawed because it's missed something that now seems wholly, straightforward. There's two types of benefit. One leads you to getting more money because there's premiums attached to that aspect of the benefit, and people weren't put onto that path when they should have been. So why was all of this review work from 2008 to 2010 so flawed?
Well, let me start by saying that clearly the courts found that we got this process wrong, and I'm sorry for the fact that this happened. And everything we are doing, and hopefully that sense came out of the report as well, everything that we are doing right now is trying to make sure that we can put this right and we can get the money to the people who are entitled to it. But no, sorry, I want to get that point in, but you rightly pushed back to what was going on in 2010. Now, look, we commissioned an internal review of what happened, so we could look into this. It's referred to in paragraph 315 of the NAO report. And I think, and this is looking back, reading the paperwork, trying to think about what was being thought about at the time, people put in place a process that they felt was going to be reduce the burden on the claimant. After all, the claimants were going to have to go through a work capability assessment. And if these were people who currently were not claiming income-related benefits, then I think it was felt at the time we didn't need to put them through a process of capturing, again, all of their income data. But at the time, and it's set out here in paragraph 2.3, at the time we then did write to them and say you could be entitled to income-related benefits, and we also phoned them. And the data we've got suggests that quite a number, something like 130,000 people, who were initially moved across to contribution-only ESA, were then subsequently moved to income-related ESA, and I imagine that was because they were responding to the communication that we were raising with them at the time. But quite rightly, and as this report very clearly sets out, the approach was wrong in law. That is what the 2014 case made clear. Also the 2015 case made clear. So we've now got to put that right.
With respect, I'm not so worried about the law. The law will take care of itself. I'm worried about the approach of the department when it's creating processes for very big changes that have a massive impact on the lives of the most vulnerable in our society. And so with respect, I'm going to carry on pushing back on this point, because it isn't just a matter of clarification of law, it's a matter of the process. And on that process point, you say that you carried out trials and there was a pilot, and obviously it missed something that now seems glaringly obvious to everybody that should have been spotted at the outset. But the Social Security Advisory Committee did ask for a pause, and that advice was ignored. Why was that?
Well, we wanted to move on, and the government decided that it wanted to move on and progress with the rollout of ESA. And I don't believe that the Social Security Advisory Council raised this issue as a reason not to progress. So I think we reviewed the views of SAC, and but this point was never raised, and neither, as you say, in our pilot was this raised, and look, we got it wrong, and I'm not not going to defend the fact that we got it wrong, because that is clearly what the court has said. So, in a sense, you're asking me to justify that. But as I say, none of the people who were moving across were claiming income-related benefits at the time. If they were, they would be on income support at the time. Everyone who was on income support within this group moved on to the income-related ESA. So these are people who weren't claiming income-related benefits, and as we would often do, we try and communicate with customers. We wrote to them, we phoned them, and so many people, 130,000 we believe, did then move across. That has left 70,000, according to our sample, according to the work that we did during the second half of last year, who we believe did not move across, did not respond to our letters, did not respond to our phone calls, and as a result we need to put that right, and I'm committed to putting that right as quickly as we can.
Just in a moment, just want to finish on this point about the process when the migration took place. Was any legal advice taken to test the robustness of the process in the system that was being created for the migration?
So this is one of the things that came out of the internal review that we did, and that's been reviewed by the National Audit Office as part of doing this review, this report that they've written. As far as we can see, there was a lot of work that was going on between policy and operational colleagues to develop and refine the mode for migrating people away from incapacity benefit into ESA. but we can't see any evidence that they had legal support at that point. And that clearly is not what we should do. That is not the process, and that is not something that we would do going forward.
Often, there are many benefit changes to the benefit system that happen, and many migrations from one system to another have to take place in your department. How often is it the case that these different individuals within your organisation don't talk to one another and legal advice is not taken at the outset?
I would think it is very rare in my experience, and the next big migration that we are looking at, of course, is universal credit. As we move people
been
across,
talking to you about universal
exactly,
credit.
and as we and there are a clear number of lessons that we have learned and will apply when we move people across from legacy benefits into universal credit. Clearly, we will, and we have changed the whole procedure, so we will make absolutely sure that there is legal advice at this point. There will be legal advice throughout. But I guess the key thing is that we will be treating every migration as a new claim, so we'll be capturing income data at that point alongside everything else. So we make sure we get it right as part of the claim.
Go back to...
Just bring Ms Flint in this point.
What's interesting about this is that, we have a reassessment process for all sorts of things for people in receipt of benefits of one form or another, because actually the department says, well, something might change, so we've got to reassess people. But you don't seem to have used that same logic when you're migrating people from a legacy benefit to a new one, to say, we've got to have a check and balance here to reassess people because something might have changed, or we might not have the information that is necessary because it's more complicated to move them from one to the other. Why is that?
Well, Ms Flint, you're asking about what was done in 2010, and our internal review has reviewed that, and clearly the procedures that should have been followed to get legal advice were not. But paragraph 2.4, I think, sort of sets out a little bit, trying to put in the mindset of where we were, where people were, 2.4 and 2.3, where we were in 2010 and what people were trying to do. I think my colleagues at the time had all the right intentions. They did not want to put people through an onerous customer journey. They wanted to move them across from...
Look, I'm not trying to suggest that let's be benign about that somehow there was a secret plan that we were going to deprive people of what they're entitled to. But it is also quite clear from the NAO report, if we look at 3.2 on page 23, first of all, the department has not been able to find specific instances of correspondence because records only go back to 2014. I find that quite interesting that there's no record before that. But there is also seen advice for decision makers from June 2013, which shows the issue was raised by frontline staff before this date. What is the mindset of an organisation that is not listening to the very views of the people, most importantly, working and advising individuals on the ground and hearing literally from the coalface what's happening?
Well, our internal review looked at this, actually, and assessed what was going on in 2013.
What was the mindset then? What do you think the mindset was when somebody from the front line, many people are putting back into the department, look, hold it, there's a problem here, this is happening, and you have obviously the stakeholder committee and everything else. Yeah. What is it that at the centre it seems to be says, computer says no?
But that isn't what happened with respect to Ms Flint back in 2013 into 2014. So what we had at that point, we had a process where people were looking at the guidance for people in the front line, the operational instructions, and they realised, in light of what people were finding as things came to decision makers, that there was something wrong. It led to an arbitration panel within the department in 2014, in April 2014, and that then led in June 2014, as is set out in the report. The whole operating instructions for migration after that were then changed. So at that point... Yeah, I thought it was a really good timeline, actually, on
which is
page,
a useful aid memoir for us.
Yeah, page 24. If you look at you've got the timeline, and then below that, you've got various boxes. The one in June 2014, the department issued new advice to its decision makers to prevent future errors. I'm stopping that sentence at that point, but you're right. But the NAO are right to say that we didn't address it.
But that doesn't take away from the fact that at the outset of a major change to this form of benefit from incapacity benefit to ESA, that there wasn't the forethought to think about potentially the different scenarios that might occur and how individuals are therefore assessed as they migrate, but also that there was information coming back into the department, and although there was a guidance change at 2014, it still was waiting to 2017 to really get anything done.
No, I would disagree with that. The guidance then meant that any migration after that point, we collect income data. So we closed the door at that point. Now I think the challenge that you could, as a committee, put to me after that is, okay, you closed the door, but why then did you not then address the ones that had already gone through the migration? Which I'm anticipating your future questions. But you're looking back. Your first part of your question, Ms. Flint, looked back to what was going on in 2010. And in 2010, let's remember, you had two benefits. You had income support, which was available to people with health conditions and was income related. And then you had Incapacity Benefit, which was a contribution-based benefit. Now, we were migrating into ESA, which itself had two elements. And I think the logic that was being applied was you've got two elements which roughly equate to those two previous benefits. Now, rather than go and put the claimants through the burden of an income test, if you've got people who currently are who aren't claiming an income-related benefit, and we're all constantly trying to encourage people to take up the benefits to which they're entitled. But if you have people in that situation and you're moving them across to the equivalent benefit in ESA, then you should do the test that is ESA specific, which is a work capability assessment. But why put them through? This was the logic, and it was wrong. But why put them through an income test?
Why wasn't there sampling done of some of the people who might be infected to see if there are any, if you like, for want of a better word, anomalies that didn't fit in nicely with this process?
Well, I think that's why we did a pilot back in 2010, and it didn't emerge.
It wasn't good enough.
Well, it didn't emerge from the pilot.
Schofield, a bit of candour would be welcome. Just one.
You said this is no legal advice was taken, and that should have been. Have you uncovered any other examples where legal advice wasn't taken? Have you gone and done it? Are you planning to do any work on any other?
Well, we conducted an internal review, and it looked back at
all other.
It looked at this whole situation, and it uncovered the issue.
Yeah, this situation, but did it look at other areas where you've had changes and you haven't taken legal advice? It's quite an easy thing to check. I'd thought that. I mean, that's not a very big job. You don't have many. I mean, there are a lot of benefits, but they're not that many changing all the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And
have you done
I'm not
that?
aware. I mean, I personally haven't done a formal check.
Well, you've only been there since January, so I'd expect you might not have done. But can you let us know when in writing? Let's move.
Yeah.
If we just go back to rollout and following on from Ms Flint's questions, we heard evidence, obviously, in the previous session. I think you were here for it, from Ms Hall in particular, about your staff at the coalface who are dealing with our constituents as these changes are being made and their lives are being massively affected. And those staff raise concerns, but they don't go anywhere. They hit a brick wall, I believe Ms Hall said. Why does that happen?
Well, I heard her say that, and I've been permanent secretary since January. I've been in the department. I was finance director general from July 2016. So I've been in the department a couple of years. One of the great privileges of doing the job I'm now doing is that I spend time, as well as time in London, I spend about the last 2 days of my working week each week around and about meeting frontline staff. And it doesn't feel like they're not willing to tell me what's going on and they're not willing to challenge, because they very much are. And the sorts of issues that were described by the previous panel, those are issues that are raised with me on an ongoing basis. I'm there listening to staff on a regular basis. Another element of the culture which I think I've been pleasantly surprised about is the way in which, as we adapt and change, so we allow and we invite comments in from frontline staff. So in Universal Credit Full Service, for example, there are mechanisms, very clear mechanisms, where as a frontline member of staff using the system, you are encouraged to say, you know what, that was fine, but it could have been better if we did it this way, and we feed those comments up. And in this role, I've been sat alongside staff in job centres where I've said to them, so what have you seen? And they would have said, oh, well, we recommended this, and did you ever see it change? Actually, we did. And then I've also spent time with the product team who sit in Caxton House, just across the way, learning about how they interpret all of this information that comes from the front line in the way that they then adapt universal credit. So there is a culture of listening to frontline staff, but we are an organisation with 84,000 colleagues all across the country, so I can't pretend we do this perfectly all the time. And one of the big things, since I've started, I've set out 4 key leadership priorities for the department, which are actually, I think, relevant to the discussion we're having today. One is that leadership should be open and engaging, building on what's been done before. The second is that we need to work in teams in the way that we work across from operations to policy to change to digital to finance. The third is that we need to work very closely and effectively with stakeholders, with other government departments. The committee, the chair will know this, previously before joining DWP, I was in charge of housing policy at DCLG. And I want us to work in DWP in a way where we join up effectively with other government departments to help to solve some of the big challenges facing public policy, but also working with partners locally on the ground. And then the fourth one, I'll finish my 4. The fourth one is that I want us to be a workplace where everyone can achieve their potential. So a workplace which recognises and reflects the community that we serve and where everyone can achieve their best. So those are the 4 things we've been talking about as a department, as a leadership team. And I think, we start from a good place on many of those areas, but there is always more we can do. And I accept that. And that's one of the things I want to do leading the organisation going forward.
Ms Mahmood.
Mr Schofield, they're all very warm words. We'll come on to whether they can be realised. I was smiling when you said that you'd found things to be pleasantly surprised about in terms of culture at the DWP. In the 8 years I've been an MP, I've only ever found things to be unpleasantly depressed about, I have to say, when it comes to DWP culture and your staff.
Right.
If you let me put my point to you, it's not just your staff saying to people like Miss Hall and the campaigners and the advisors in this area, they've said it to me as well, that they raise and escalate concerns, but there's very much a computer says no culture at institutional level. Surely you accept that the experience of ESA rollout is at least indicative of cultural institutional failure?
No, I don't accept that. The point I was going to do, I apologise for interrupting you, Ms Mahmood. I mean, one of the things I was going to suggest, if you haven't done it already, is go and visit your local job centre and spend time.
I don't need advice about how to engage with stakeholders in my patch.
You always have. You always have.
Whereas it's your first outing as Permanent Secretary.
Thank you.
We've had your 4-point plan, we're having generous offers to visit job centres. I think we get the picture. Okay. You can schmooze us as much as you want, you've got to answer Ms Mahmood's questions.
It would be really helpful if you could now address the point about cultural institutional failure at the DWP in relation to the rollout of ESA.
Well, look, I think there were 3 phases in this episode, in this whole thing, which is set out, I think, clearly in here. The first phase took us to 2014. When we changed the guidance for decision makers and when we had the court cases that established the position of the law. Although the final case was 2015.
But I don't need the phases. I'm talking about. We've read the report. I know what's in the report. We know what happened.
So I think the big challenge is really what was going on from that court case in June 2015, the judgment in 2015, and then the point in May 2016. When the urgency of doing something about this became clear through the process of analysing the fraud and error statistics for 15-16 that were published, as I say, 2 years ago. So I think that's a big challenge, and the challenge there, the issue there, I think, is putting enough priority to these sort of situations where the courts have said you've got your interpretation wrong. So I don't think that's a culture. So I'm pushing back on your description. What we do need to do is improve the priority that we give to putting these sorts of cases right, which is why I've created...
Sorry, and Mr Schofield, I am pushing right back, because as I say, this isn't about the court judgments, this is about your staff at coalface level telling you there is a problem, and it's a big problem, and people who are the most vulnerable in our society are suffering as a result. And you're saying that actually from 2016 onwards you had got to the bottom of it, or at least there was some element of the systemic problem coming forward and being well understood. But in February 2017 the advice you gave to ministers was to do more analysis. I mean, it begs the question, well, what kind of more further analysis did you think you needed when all of these problems have been stacking up and your department knew about them from 2013 onwards?
Well, crucially, in February 2017, we believed we needed clear legal advice on what our liability was and what we needed to do, what people were entitled to, and what we needed to do. So that was, and the National Audit Office have been through that and know that is what we were doing at that point. We went to Council to get legal advice. And we were able then, in July 2017, we were very clear about what we were required to do, at which point we started the process of the sample of 1,000 cases.
Ms Mahmood's raised the cultural
issues. Yeah.
We're all MPs, and we have at our surgeries repeatedly.
Yeah.
Constituents come to see us with letters from your department, which are frankly incomprehensible. And in fact, sometimes I've had the privilege of having an auditor sit with me, and they also have sometimes found them pretty challenging. In I'm not sure which one, open, and maybe it comes under open and engaging, I'm not sure, but working with stakeholders, certainly, you've got your 4-point plan. Yeah. Are you going to get these letters better so that actually we can understand them and our constituents can understand them? Because they're very scary when you've been told you've been overpaid £5,000, but in a very wordy way. Well,
I'll give you another example. I was sat in a Brighton job centre about 2 weeks ago, involved in sitting alongside a work coach, and a claimant came in with a letter, and I'm afraid the permanent secretary at DWP didn't fully understand the nature of the letter. So you can imagine what I did when I got back into the department, and that letter will be changing.
It's on its way, is it?
Well,
or is it
no, well, look, we've got to get this right. And one of the points that this report gets into is how do we address issues around fraud and error more broadly, which I'm sure you want to come on to. But one of those is that we need to make it easier for claimants to come forward and understand what it is that we're asking for, so that they can give us the right information so we can get the claims right first time.
Well, we'll hold you to account in the letters. We're all we've got a little litmus test for you here. We're seeing that let us know
where you spot those letters.
We'll send you our worst ones. There's a challenge to the committee. The top few bad ones each month. Ms Mahmood.
Well, and just following on from that, you will have heard some of the evidence in the earlier session. Like all the other MPs and veteran of trying to decipher DWP letters, it seems to me where the DWP makes an overpayment, you're very quick, straight off the bat, threatening letter, lots of action being taken against people who frankly can't afford to pay the money back. Certainly in my constituency that's often the case. Where the underpayment is concerned, certainly this episode seems to suggest your department's not that interested in dealing with issues of underpayment. What would you have to say in terms of your difference of approach, your very clear difference of approach when it comes to communicating with claimants in relation to overpayments as opposed to where an underpayment has occurred?
Well, look, I'm very happy to hear of specific cases if you wanted to bring them to my attention. But look, we have got, as the committee knows, we have a target for underpayment, reducing the level of underpayment. We have a focus on reducing the level of overpayments. Both are considered by the Controller and Auditor General when he reviews our accounts at the end of the year. And I would love to be the first accounting officer for 29 years to avoid a qualification of my accounts. So both matter. Both sorting out overpayments and sorting out underpayments.
With respect, firstly, you had to be pushed in order to have a target for your underpayments. It didn't happen automatically, so I don't think you can clock that as a win for your department. And secondly, the target only takes you to the level of underpayment in 2014-15, I believe. I don't think that's any big success to want to write home about. But Mr. Schofield, I'm talking about the approach and the attitude, the corporate institutional attitude that your department has in relation to overpayments and underpayments. And you're a brave man if you try to tell any member of parliament on this committee that you have to have been around the system for a very long time before you clock there's a big difference of approach between overpayment and underpayment. So I invite you again to show that you're really listening to the point we're making and explain why that differential between overpayment and underpayment and cultural attitude at your department occurs.
Well, I think the point that the big issue that I think we needed to address was around giving priority in cases where the courts have said that there is an underpayment to get on and progress that and prioritise that. Now, I have created, since we did this internal review of this particular case, it has identified this as an issue. So I've created a new board, a new governance board, that is responsible for keeping an eye on these situations as they emerge. It's chaired by a member of my executive team. It is intended to give the right priority to getting on and progressing these, so that when we trade off between the pressures of running the operation on a day-to-day basis and going back and sorting out mistakes that have been made in the past, we give the right priority to that. So that's what I've done. I've created that. That board is meeting. That board will hold the rest of the department to account to make sure that we make these payments.
Mr. Schofield, I think let's move on from underpayments. I don't think we're going to agree, and I can't push you any further, I don't think, on your department's attitude. Between 2013 and 2017, so a period of concerns being raised that we can verify up to acceptance of legal responsibility to pay. I mean, lots of people in your department were aware but not talking to one another, and it took the fraud and error team escalating matters in order for things to really come straight to the top. So why were so many people in your department asleep on the job?
So I think you're talking about the period from June 2015 until May 2016. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier around that we weren't giving enough priority to this alongside other things that we were doing in the department. I mean, the internal review has gone through this and has identified some information about some of the discussions that were going on. I think it's referred to in the report. And so, sorry, should I carry on?
I thought actually the NOA wanted to come in, but...
Okay.
No, through me, please. Through me, please.
You're referring to when the Fraud and Error Department first picked it up, which was in 2014 through to 20.
Is that what, I think that's what was... I think you were referring to the earlier date.
In the process rather than later.
I think, well, our internal review concluded that it was probably... our internal review concluded it was right to wait until the conclusion of the DJ court case, which is, if you look on page 17, was the June 2015 case. I can understand why we were waiting for that, because that in a sense, although with hindsight the advice we got in 2017 was that the case in October 2014 was an even more important one. Actually, June 2015 was actually a conversion case. So there is an argument for saying we were right to wait for that. But from that period onwards, certainly until May 2016, I think you're right to challenge us as to why we weren't making more progress with getting on with this.
I'm right to challenge you. I am challenging you. I'm not really receiving much by way of answer. So why weren't you picking this up?
Well, all I can say, and this is what our internal review suggested, that at a time when we had other competing work pressures, we didn't put enough priority on sorting this out.
Would you like to apologise to our many constituents who've been affected as a result of that lack of priority given to underpayments to the most vulnerable in our society?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I am so sorry. And I felt that was a comment I made at the very beginning, but look, I'm sorry that we haven't got on with it, but we are getting on with it now, and I can assure all of your constituents and claimants involved that we are giving this the top priority. And not only that, as I said earlier, this new governance board will make sure we always do that in the future.
Do you also accept that it was wrong for you to originally try to suggest that this might be as a result of claimant error as opposed to official departmental error?
Well, I mean, I think the courts said very clearly that.
About the court, I want to know about you and your department, your staff, your officials. Do you accept that the initial attempt, which went, I believe, to internal arbitration, to categorise this as claimant error was wrong? That should not have happened.
No, look, so our internal arbitration panel in April 2014 concluded exactly as the way you said, and that was
wrong. Do you accept it was wrong to try and say this was claimant error as opposed to official error?
Well, it was
Thank you.
Claimant error, and it was very clear from the court's judgment as it happened. It was the October 2014 was the crucial one that we should have treated the two elements of ESA as a single benefit.
Well, it was clear to everybody, not your department, and I'm glad you've accepted. I've accepted that now. I want to just pick up on the issue about Section 27 of the Social Security Act. I appreciate that there are legal issues pending, but would you confirm to me that you agree with the evidence given in our previous session about some cases, potentially a large number, that have been settled where backdated payments have been made from the date of migration as opposed to the date of the 2014 court case?
So we, as the report says, we got legal opinion, authoritative legal opinion on this through the course of early 2017. So we knew the position in July 2017, and the legal advice at that point was that Section 27 should apply, and it should be applied back to the LH court case, which was the 21st of October 2014. What we did before that...
Backdating to the date of migration that has occurred, and we heard of a case earlier on which goes from January 2018, where there has been a full backdating to the date of migration, not the date of court case. Do you accept that this has occurred and is occurring still, which flies in the face of your decision to apply the 2014 ruling?
Well, that was a surprise to me, and I'm very happy to follow up with the previous panel.
To other officials,
I mean, Emma may want to...
Dad, do you recognise what's being described?
I'd be interested to hear more detail about the case from January 18, because it shouldn't have been happening that we backdate pre-21st of October 2014.
Pursue that outside this meeting, but we will get information right to you and make sure that we are in that loop, Ms Mahmood. Okay, Ms Morris, Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you. I can't help thinking, Mrs Schofield, that you're more concerned about the numbers than people on benefits and the sort of catastrophic lives they've led since the error was made. Is this really just a numbers game?
No, it's about people's lives.
Then when you, to Ms Mahmood, said that you apologised, do you think it's enough just to look at the finances, to wait for legal advice? Do you think there should be something you're doing now for some people who, frankly, are living a quality of life which I think any government would say is unacceptable?
Absolutely. What I need to do now is get them the money to which they're entitled to, and that is absolutely my priority.
Don't you think it's a bit late?
Well, it may be late, but we need to get on and do it, and we'll do it by April.
And I like the full leadership messages, but I heard absolutely nothing about how you're going to implement it and how you're going to measure it. It doesn't give me much comfort. How are you going to do it?
What, sorry, the full leadership?
The full leadership. How are you going to make it happen? How are you going to measure it? How is that going to help all these claimants?
Well, I mean, I guess there are a number of ways of measuring it, but I don't want to go through all four of those and come up with a way of measuring those.
It's not a confirmatory hearing. We don't quite have that power.
No, that's right.
Yeah, but I want to know, Mr Schofield, what are you going to do about it? I don't want theory. I don't want promises. Physically, what are you going to do?
I'm going to pay them.
But you're not going to do that tomorrow, are you?
Well, I am doing it at the moment. I'm doing it every day. Day by day, we're paying more people. We've now recruited the full team, but we've been paying since August 2017.
How long is it going to take you to pay everyone?
April.
And do you feel absolutely bulletproof convinced that you have collected on your data everybody who's affected?
Yes, and I mean, Emma could talk you through the whole process if you like.
I don't want the whole process. I just want to know, are you confident?
Yeah, no, I am. And I've sat with one of the teams as they've made an outgoing phone call to someone affected to just hear myself what the process is. It is very thorough. Even in what was actually turned out to be a relatively straightforward case, the phone call itself took half an hour. And we went through very thoroughly a whole host of pieces of information about income. I'm
delighted that you are so hands-on. The trouble is, one person being hands-on is not going to change the culture, as Ms Mahmood referred to. So it's great to hear the case studies, but it still doesn't convince me that you really are on top of it. It's not you we need to be on top of it, well we do, but we need everybody else to be on top of it.
To what's going to happen in the future. But very quick fire from Caroline Flint, then Siobhan Mahmood, and then over to Mr Morgan.
Could you just
For me, when you're going to be assessing what people should be reimbursed or rebated with, will that include looking at all the other potential benefits they've missed out on? Will it include whether they've incurred penalties, for example, in terms of debts and other things they may have incurred as a result of not being paid the right money?
No, what we're doing is we're looking at what they are legally entitled to, and we're getting on and paying that.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to pick up Mr Schofield on the evidence you were just giving me about the court cases. I've got an extract here from your June 2013 guidance, which makes it very, very clear and says in black and white this was official error, and yet the evidence you've given to us today says that you're waiting for the legal cases in 2015. How do you reconcile those two facts?
I may pass to James for a bit more chapter and verse on that. But I think there is a difference here between claimant error and official error on the one hand, and then categories of official error on the other. And the key point here is the October 2014 court case, and it's sort of set out here, I think, in figure 3, page 17. It made clear that whereas before we might have treated ESA income-related and ESA contribution as two separate benefits, and remember what I was saying earlier about what we were migrating from onto, those were a single benefit, and at that point what that then meant conclusively is that when you were moving someone onto either element of that benefit, you had to assess them on the other element.
Our exchange was about a lack of urgency in dealing with these cases at an institutional level, and you said to me you were waiting for law cases in 2015, but your own internal guidance acknowledges the official error.
James.
So I think the key point here, and I appreciate the desire to kind of remove the legal complexity, but it is unfortunately highly relevant here, is that at that point in time in 2013, it was quite right that those cases would have been viewed as official error, because the courts hadn't yet at that point said that a claim for any element of ESA was a claim for the whole benefit, and that changes the whole basis on which those claims would be looked at and reassessed. So I think it's easy to sort of look back with the benefit of hindsight as if this was glaringly obvious, but actually the situation has evolved over time as we've discovered more about the problem. And in 2013 there was insufficient evidence that this was a systemic problem of law that was then clarified by those later judgments. So the situation did change with those judgments.
On a case that had nothing to do with this benefit, the 2014 decision was an unrelated issue. It just happened to make a finding about ESA. So you can't expect to say with any credibility that that's the case that you were waiting for, which led to the lack of urgency at institutional level.
But no, that is an interesting point, I think, and when we look back on this, and this came up in our internal review, the one that at the time everyone was focusing on, because it was a conversion case, was the DJ case, which in the end didn't get resolved until June 2015. But it was when we did our assessment, when we had our legal advice, this time kind of last year, concluded by July last year, it was at that point that the lawyers looked at this and said, no, actually, the key point here, the key point of law was one that had previously been established back to October 2014, which is why we pay back to 21st of October 2014, not back to June 2015.
Legal knots were out there. There was a lot of people waiting for money. Mr. Stephen Morgan.
We heard powerfully earlier from one of the witnesses the impact that the errors were having on people's lives and people's mental health, and thank you for that earlier. I wondered what you have to say to those affected.
Look, I'm sorry to all those who are affected, and what I'm saying to them is we're going to put this right, and we'll put this right as quickly as we can.
Mr. Morgan.
We've set ourselves till April to do it.
Mr. Morgan.
And you think that's an adequate response for the 70,000 people affected?
Paying them the money to which they're entitled to, I think, is the thing that they would most care about, and I want to get on and do it.
And what about compensation then?
Well, we don't pay blanket compensation in situations where the courts have told us to interpret a piece of legislation in a particular way. We don't do that. I've looked carefully at this. Well, I've looked carefully at this in the context. I have a responsibility as accounting officer. I've looked carefully at this in the context of managing public money. And the key point here is around creating precedents that put the taxpayer at risk.
Significant impact on people's lives. Don't you think they owe more than what you're offering? Some form of compensation surely makes sense.
Well, that is the position. We don't pay blanket compensation.
If I may say, you're kind of hiding behind the law there, because there was an acknowledgement in the department that there was an error, regardless of what the legal position is and what the eventual judicial review comes up with. So if there was an official error, there are consequential benefits which people didn't get for a start. That's quite quantifiable, potentially. Or a formula could be introduced. But, I mean, you've not considered it at all at any step of the way. I mean, I know you went here all the way through. You've analysed it as an accounting officer. Has there been any other discussion about compensation packages?
No, we have. I've looked at the general question as to whether we should pay compensation in this way, in this situation, and concluded that it doesn't fit with the basis on managing public money. So, no, we're not paying blanket compensation in this situation.
Will you then be undertaking a full impact assessment of the errors at all?
Well, we are paying what people are legally entitled to. So we are going through case by case, person by person, what they are legally entitled to.
So does that, just to be clear then, if you were paying prescription charges or something, the passported benefits, would they individually be able to get those refunded if they can prove? I mean, if they can prove that they've had to pay those.
Well, we're not introducing a blanket compensation scheme.
That's
but what
not
we
what
do.
I asked.
No,
so you're looking at them individually. So you're doing.
So all I would say, and because I don't particularly want to get drawn on individual circumstances, because individual circumstances are.
Well, I haven't asked about an individual circumstance. I'm saying if a class action, I don't know, if 300 people had paid prescription charges, one person had paid prescription charges, that's a benefit that they should have had if they'd been on the right rate. Are you going to make sure that they're reimbursed for those additional costs?
No, I've assessed this from the point of view of accounting officer, and I don't believe that is consistent with managing public money.
Just absolutely blanket no. I mean, it just seems really hard if you were on a lower level than you should have been at the time, that you were paying out from a lower income level anyway.
I understand why the committee is making that point.
Well, if the process had been implemented in the right way, then they would have been entitled to those passported benefits. So it's part of the package of what they would have been entitled to.
So I guess at the end of the day, the point here is that no one was prevented from claiming an income-related benefit. Now, at the time we did this migration, we wrote to people and we said you could be entitled to income-related benefits. And as I said before,
it would be better if I understand from the informal letter you sent. Which would have been, to be honest, to most people, it's a human thing. If you see something saying you'd be better off, you think you might take a bit of notice.
You're right. I mean, the NAO are right on that. I mean, I've looked myself at the letter. We believe something like 130,000 people responded to that and did move across and did migrate across.
There's a lot. Well, I'll bring Stephen Morgan in to continue this, Mr. Morgan.
How you will ensure the process is completed both accurately and on time?
Okay. Well, I might bring Emma in on this. I mean, but the key point is that, as your previous panellist said, we are looking through all 300,000 cases that could be covered by this. So these are people who migrated between the end of 2010, beginning of 2011 and 2014, who were migrated onto the contribution-only ESA benefit, and we're going to go through those in great detail.
Your report, it looks like you're still developing a process for those that have died. Could you say a bit more about where that's got to and what you propose to do?
Yeah, so we are still just finalising that process for deceased claimants. We're looking at the best way to contact people where we haven't. Well, we've got next of kin. It's an easy process. Where we haven't, we're working with. Hopefully starting that in June. So
hopefully,
it's
definitely.
No, not definitely. Hopefully.
Hopefully.
So okay. Process for people who've died.
Of working through the deceased claimants.
Without next of kin, or is that all deceased?
All deceased claimants taken.
So why is that taken so long?
Because we want to do it as compassionately and carefully as possible, and it's a tricky process to try and get in touch with people who don't have a next of kin on our systems.
And how many people do you think that affects?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have to write to you.
Could you write to us about that? Would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to finally ask around how would you ensure this exercise does not impact on the service already being received by ESA claimants?
then?
Yeah, so Emma's running both, so she can talk about that.
So this exercise has had to be staffed and resourced completely separately from any normal business on ESA. It's had a demand of 400 people. They've been separately resourced. I have actually taken 400 of my most experienced processes, because it's quite a complicated process looking back several years over people's cases, but then they've been backfilled. So they are two completely separate resourcing issues.
Okay. I mean, of those 400 great people then being moved, so are you sure it's not going to have an impact? You're really sure that it's not going to have an impact somewhere else? We're going to wait and see another problem arise because you've taken your best team.
I'm hopeful it won't. We've got the right resources in place on both, and there's lots of quality checking and training that goes into both.
I think we're all shocked when we saw the figures in the NEO report about what it's costing. About 14 million is what you. That's still your estimate.
Yes.
Mr. Luke Graham.
Sorry, Chair. Just taking a glass of water. Thanks. I want to try and actually look forward a little bit more. So what lessons have been learned and what potential problems or opportunities there are going forward. So I think one area that the NAO report put up was paragraph 1.1, where it was talking about some of the internal reviews and certainly from the NAO analysis as well, that ultimately the analysis that led to DWP taking some actions, the NAO still raised their concerns, and even in the most recent financial audit raised the concern that the DWP still has to do more work to realise the benefits of actually of their work on fraud and error. So I would just ask the question, should we be concerned that there are further problems in your statistics, that we've got another kind of ESA problem hidden away somewhere?
No, thanks for the question, Mr. Graham. Well, there's a small section which I could pad out actually on page 27 in terms of lessons learned. But I think you're asking a broader question around fraud and error and some of the wider points that are raised throughout the report on fraud and error. And in answer to Ms. Mahmood's questions earlier, I wanted to emphasise that both overpayments and underpayments matter, and we need to bear down on those. So, as the report says, and as the NAO have separately referred to in the annual report and accounts at the end of last year, we do have a more structured approach to tackling fraud and error than we've had before. A number of things have been done. In January last year, we brought together the policy, the operational and change teams that have responsibility for fraud and error into a single directorate under a single director, who I can hold accountable for driving down levels of fraud and error going forward. We have a much better way of getting a handle on the causes of fraud and error, benefit by benefit. So we have what's called a heat map where we can go through, we can see how much, as we analyse the data, how much fraud and error is related to different elements of the claim process, benefit by benefit.
Sorry, just on your heat map, how hot is ESA, and are there any other hotspots that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, so on ESA, I mean, the latest data shows that underpayments went down from 16, 17 to 17, 18 from 2.9% to 2.6%. I'd love them to be lower than that. They should clearly, we want to get them lower than that. There are other areas of heat, I suppose, put it that way. So housing benefit is an area of significant levels of fraud and error. So these are, one of the key things that comes out of our work on fraud and error is the importance of the way we design benefits to design fraud and error out of the system. So universal credit, for example, as we introduce it, we're currently not measuring fraud for the full service, we are for the live service, but for the full service, there are elements to that which design some of the risk of fraud and error out of what will be the successes to housing benefit and ESA. So in particular, when we look at the way that we have to change the level of benefit according to changes in earnings, we have the direct feed from HMRC on real-time earnings, which enables us to be ahead of the game. And the key thing is to use some of that for prevention as well as for detection.
So no, I mean, it's good to know you have got the heat map and you've tightened up the kind of risk analysis. So we shouldn't have a repeat of an ESA type situation again in 2-3 years' time.
Well, this is what I mean. Look, I know you are, aren't you? So I'm obviously starting to squirm. No.
You've got your 4-point plan. Nothing can
got my
go wrong,
4-point plan. Shall I just go back to that? The logic of this, as we become more structured and more focused, we should be able to get a better handle as these things emerge. Clearly, as we introduce new benefits, so new things come along that we need to prepare, we need to plan for and design out of the system. So we need to get a handle on that. I mean, the great thing about rolling out universal credit in the way that we are, it gives us the opportunity to test and learn as we go along and make changes to clamp down on levels of overpayment and underpayment.
And do you find the universal credit and the direction of travel with most of the other benefits, you now have a tight enough feedback loop that if you encounter similar problems again, these will be tackled in a more timely manner than certainly they have been in the case with the ESA? Because obviously it's a number of years, as you've already said, a number of people have even died waiting on some of this benefit. So actually, can you now, and looking forward rather than kind of trying to kick you for things past, but can you say we've got the risk analysis and we've got an effective feedback loop to make sure this doesn't happen again? Or if it does, we can tackle it within 6 to 12 months?
Well, we do. As I say, under single leadership now with a new director responsible for all of that, we should certainly do that. And I would say, I mean, that we can, you can rightly challenge me as to what was going on certainly after June 2015, as Ms Mahmood has already, but the reality is it was a structured approach to fraud and error that identified this in May 2016. It was when people were looking at that ESA underpayment figure, which had gone up quite significantly in that year as a percentage of the benefit, and they were able to say, well, what is going on, and targeting into that. And that structured approach identified something that you could rightly say should have been spotted earlier by other people.
But just to, I mean, I was going to say on some of that would be some of the NAO's analysis as well, right, that help highlight the fraud, not just internal processes.
Yeah, look, we have an ongoing dialogue with the NAO. Hopefully the NAO will feel this is a fruitful one. I certainly do. And the Controller and Auditor General in our end-of-year accounts writes his own report on what he thinks of what we've done. And there were sort of some positives I took away from Sir Amos's review back in June last year, but clearly further work to be done.
Understood. Just looking at some of the underpayment rates, when you look at fraud, it looks like the state pension is almost the kind of gold standard, the benchmark. Very, very low rates there. It's about 0 or 0.1%. When you're looking now at the ESA target of 0.9% of expenditure, do you really think that's challenging enough? Especially when you're looking at the 2011-2012 underpayments being at 0.8%.
Yeah, but I mean the latest statistics show that they were at 1.0%. So it's clearly we clearly need to improve our performance to get down to that level.
Mm-hmm. Help me with that. Sorry, because it's a percentage of expenditure. But how many people does that represent?
How many people does that represent?
So 0.9% of expenditure. If it's the average award we see where it's underpayment before is 5,000 each. I mean, we can do some simple division, but I'm hoping you know approximately 0.9% in pound terms, what that means in people terms.
Well, we can do it in terms of the amount of money at stake, of course. So, I mean, it's 1.7 billion in underpayments. But, I mean, so we don't... The reason I'm sort of hesitating is that the way we calculate that is by sampling. And we're looking at individual claims. And we then work this out in a quantum of money. Well, I could take a sort of, but I just think I'd be misleading the committee, to be honest, if I were to try and do some
I think Mr. Grant.
The point I'm making here is that a number of my colleagues, were questioning you about culture and making sure that DWP is people focused as well as process. Yeah. I understand and appreciate that DWP is systemic, and certainly where I sit in my constituency, where they're looking to devolve some powers, local devolved authorities are finding the difficulties of having a system like that too. But what I would say is that it is important. I find it a little concerning that the most senior people can't tell me approximately how many people a percentage represents, because that's ultimately who it impacts. Because by setting what seems, you're getting close to last year, 1%, 0.9, you're basically saying, I'm okay with this level of fraud or underpayment. I'm okay with it. So how many people? Is it 10,000? Is it 5,000? Is it 20,000? I think that's important, and I think it makes the point that my other colleagues made about the kind of cultural emphasis within the DWP being on the numbers, not necessarily the people.
Well, we are all about the people, to be honest. That is what we're all about.
With great respect, your answer that you just gave didn't reinforce that. But I'll move on because I don't want to. Yeah, I will want to go into just a couple of the questions just to be clear. In our prior session, Ms Hall from the National Association of Welfare Advisors did mention a number of cases where claimants had got their full historic repayment, so pre-2014.
Covered that.
You've just got that. The reason I'm asking just to try and fill out the figures, because obviously when we're looking at the analysis, if we played that through, if we do decide to go all the way through, we had the estimates of 100 to 150 million being of the historic estimates, but also in the original set of costs that we've got the historic payments, which are the 340. Then we had 680 million of extra payments, which we do looking forward to 2018 to 2023. Yeah. My question is that then, if we do take on the additional historic payments pre-2014, are there any additional future costs in addition to that 680 million? Because you may be taking in some additional people and additional claims going behind the kind of 2014 line.
No, we wouldn't be taking any additional people. And I thought figure 4 is actually quite helpful in terms of understanding the different nature of the claimants. But no, look, there is a court case going on about our interpretation of Section 27 of the 1998 Act. So we think we should wait and see.
Fine. Okay. My question was really around if you think there's any further liability beyond your kind of central estimate of that 680, the future costs. So I was just asking the question that if there were further historical claims, would that kind of stretch the envelope further? And I think
no. So paragraph 211 has got the payments looking back, and then looking forward. I mean, it's the same people.
Fine. Okay. If that's an easy thing.
No. 400 of your best staff working on this right now. Will they have to go back if there was a decision, whatever, we don't go into why, but if there was a decision to go back to 2011, would those 400 staff have to go through the paperwork again, or would you be able to pay that quickly?
I don't want to speculate about where the court case is going on, but the work we're doing, because what we have to do, we have to go back and we have to establish when they migrated as part of this.
So once you've got that figure, it's easy is not the right word. It's easier, is it?
We're collecting as much data as we can right back to the point of migration, because we need to, even for this exercise.
Fine. So you'll have the information to act quicker.
So I think we can do it. We could act quicker, but obviously let's see.
Just to turn back to the target question. Obviously you've got the 4-point plan that you went through earlier. Do you have a kind of pathway to get to almost the pensions level of fraud and errors and underpayments? So have you got a map to get you down from 0.9 to something more reasonable like 0.5 or 0?
So on fraud and error, on overpayments and underpayments, every benefit has its own challenges, which is why we're taking this structured approach. For the pensions population, it is by its very nature a very stable population in terms of we know how many people are coming through. The nature of the benefit is such that it is much easier to avoid fraud and error.
My question really is that are you 0.9, is that just a stable target, or is there a dynamic target that you're saying looking ahead, you're new in the role, you're going to sit there and say, no, I want this down to 0.5%, and that's what it should be about?
Well,
we have that at the moment?
I'm going to play the boring accounting officer point on that, which just because Amos is watching. But I think the point I would make is that I want to get the right balance here. I want to get this down as low as possible, but they will get to a point, no doubt, where this is true of overpayments as well as underpayments. Chasing that last overpayment or last underpayment gets to a point where it costs so much to chase it down, it's not worth doing. And quite rightly, the Controller and Auditor General would say to me, is that a value for money thing to be doing? So I don't want to be, so that sounds like a rather boring way of responding, but part of this structured approach is trying to find out where that sweet spot is for over and underpayments benefits.
I don't appreciate that, and to reflect back my accountant side from my previous life to you then, if we were drawing out the curve of looking at the cost, where would you draw that line then where the marginal cost would be so much higher than the actual marginal benefit? Is it indeed at 0.9, or is it 0.8 or 0.7 or 0.4? If you're saying you're based on an analytical approach, I fully support that. I'm just asking you where it is on that curve.
That's a really good question, and to be honest, I don't know the answer, in part because we are embedding this structured approach, and in part also because technology and being able to sort of look at data in different ways through data matching opens up new possibilities. It may mean that kind of sweet spot moves over time, hopefully to a lower level. So we are pioneering things like data matching on underpayments. So, for example, where we have situations where our data about someone suggests they should be claiming, say, a premium when they're not, that enables us to trigger some response. These are the sorts of things that we could do more of as we introduce more automated benefits and as we make the most of the opportunities to use data in different ways.
Last 2 points, Chair, if that's okay. One, I guess, is more Ms Haddad on that delivery point, just returning to the questions that the Chair had put to you about the staff. Obviously, 400 staff have moved over, you've got 245 in, you're 155 short. Can you just assure the committee that there are no other, because there's a lot of stress on DWP at the moment and lots of calls on its time, no other projects have been sunk or cut off as a result of this staff movement?
No, they haven't. I can assure the committee. So all of our customer services is resourced on the basis of demand. So I know what demand I've got across the working age benefits. This is additional demand. Everything is resourced to demand.
£14 million estimate cost.
Yeah,
which is quite, which sort of did shock us all.
That's fine. And Chair, my final question was just how can you improve? This service obviously has let a number of people down. For you, Ms Haddad, for the kind of delivery point, what solid steps are you going to take, from today looking forward, to really help people with severe illness and disabilities access welfare?
So I think I go back to what the Permanent Secretary said earlier. I mean, when I'm out and about chatting to my 12,000 staff, they are all absolutely passionate about customer service, want to do exactly the right thing, and making sure people get their correct money within the confines of the processes. So we're building on that. I take their frontline ideas all the time. I take their feedback, and we've got very strict quality checking regimes in place.
If we ever come into a situation again then where the staff or the teams don't take the kind of timely legal advice that leads to the mistake that we've had with ESA, what would now be the mechanism that you've set in place to address that?
So I don't think we would come across it again, because now we do have proper systems and checks in place that whenever a new operational instruction is being drawn up, there are a strict list of people who have to sign it off, including lawyers, and then ultimately a senior official.
I'm going to bring in Anne-Marie Morris and Karen on two quick fires on this issue, and then we're going to move on to a couple of other issues. So quick fire, please.
Following Mr Graham, you've effectively said you've made no provision for any judgment that means you'd have to pay out pre-2014. You've made no provision for any compensation, yet you say that you could pay very quickly if suddenly the court went against you and you could get the figures back to 2011. Question: have you made any calculation of the amount involved, and if so, what is it?
Well, it's the figure in 211.
But that doesn't include pre-2014 plus the compensation, the benefits that were missed, and some people who have found themselves in positions which it actually means they would have, in terms of compensation for maladministration, substantially more than I suspect you've included in that figure.
No, sorry. So as I say, we're not paying compensation. What this figure does is include the estimate that we made in November 2017 of the costs were we to pay back to the point of migration. But as I say, the way we apply Section 27 of the 1998 Act, we don't believe that that's what we should be doing.
Right.
So,
didn't this clarify for me? Does that then include back to 2011 in terms of, one, what they should have been paid, two, the extra benefits, the historic cases that Ms Flint has raised in terms of the benefits they should have had, and then finally the bit they should get for maladministration, because actually things have happened to them in their lives which actually have a financial consequence.
So this is their ESA entitlement. This is what they're legally
Legally for a minute, because at the moment,
you're right,
the court case, we don't know what is legal and what isn't. I'm just trying to work out what's in it, because my concern is that's an underestimate of what the department would have to pay if all three elements that I've talked about actually had to be paid out.
I want to be absolutely clear. You talked about three elements. This covers one element, and it's very clear in 211 what it covers.
Okay, well, that answers the question, Ms Flint.
Well, Mr Schofield, you talked about DWP being a people organisation. It is a people organisation. It deals with obviously so many people with so many different issues. And ESA, I have to say, compared to incapacity benefit, should be a better deal, if that was the thing. But you seem to make a rod for your own back, and you talk about priorities. So why don't you, here's a cost-saving measure, why is it that you are still embarking on a process whereby people with motor neurone disease even though they're on ESA, are going to have to be reassessed before they get to the point where they'll never be reassessed again. That's the case, isn't it? If you're new coming onto ESA with motor neurone disease, you'll have that assessment and no more. But if you're currently on ESA and have motor neurone disease, you will have to have another reassessment before you'll be able to have the certainty that that's something you won't have to go through again. Surely that's a cost-saving measure, and that will help staff to get on with other things.
Oh, Mr. Wolfe.
So the short answer is that we won't have the information from their previous assessments that we would need under the law to apply the severe conditions criteria that you're talking about. But what I would say is it's highly unlikely that anyone in that case would be invited to a face-to-face assessment.
Sorry, why not? Why won't you have the information that granted them at ESA in the first place that they have motor neurone disease, which, to all intents and purposes, is a debilitating disease that they will eventually die from?
So there's two slightly different things. I mean, I think the important answer to that is that for someone in that position, they shouldn't be invited to a face-to-face assessment. We should be able, based on what we know on paper, to do a paper-based assessment for that individual. But what we don't have, because the severe conditions criteria weren't in place when they were originally assessed, is we won't have the information that we would need to apply that to them without that assessment. But it wouldn't necessarily be a face-to-face assessment.
So they're getting ESA on the basis already. They're getting ESA on the basis now that they have motor neurone disease. But you're saying that is not enough to just draw, just say that's all we need. You don't have to be reassessed again. That's not enough.
That is the way that the process works. Yes, but it would not necessarily be a face-to-face.
But my constituent, Mr. Leswood, had to go and have another face-to-face just the other week for his ESA.
Well, it'd be again. We need to see the details of the individual case.
So, how many people have you worked out will not have to have a face-to-face, and it will just be paper only? Have you done that? Have you done the sums for that?
I'll have to let the committee know after this session.
I want to write to you because at least two members of this committee have got direct cases of this where it's clearly not doing what you think it's doing on the ground. So we worry that that's okay. It's a small sample, but that's the tip of an iceberg, and it's not just motor neurone disease, but other people with lifelong issues that may be affected. So we'll take that offline. I'm sure Ms. Keegan and Ms. Flint, well, I don't need to tell you that you need to be very, very worried if they're joining forces to take on, let alone the committee. And we're going to move on now. Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
The sword of Damocles hung over 2,000 staff who were working for HMRC on tax credits and were due to move to DWP to deal with universal benefit. They were based in Dundee and Preston. What's happened to them?
Well, so this was part of an original plan to move people across to manage universal credit. But where we've got to now is that we've been looking ahead at the workload in the way actually that Emma was describing earlier. For all our benefits, we look at the amount of work we expect to come in and the likely number of people that we'll need to be able to deliver this. And we've realised we don't need as many people. So we are offering HMRC staff the opportunity to stay in HMRC if they want to stay in HMRC. And those that we need, the numbers that we need, we'll be bringing across, and we're talking to HMRC around that in great detail.
How many numbers are you anticipating will transfer across?
It's a much smaller number. I'll have to write to the committee with the latest number. But it's
because you see that impacts on whether you're going to take up any space in these new government super regional offices. Is the DWP basically going to redeploy its staff into those regional offices or not?
It depends on different places. So that's a wider question, one we're talking to the Cabinet Office around in terms of where we need to be for our operations. And we are in the process of a very big estates programme as we get out of a 20-year contract that we had with Telereal Trillium, and we move forward into something much more flexible going forward. In some parts of the country, we're able to be in the central government hub. In other places, it doesn't work for our business in the same way. So recently, we announced in Cardiff, for example, that we're going to be north of Cardiff in a place called Treforest, rather than in central Cardiff. But that's the nature of what we need in terms of where we need to be for our operation.
But given that we're dealing with a substantial number of people's lives here, when do you think you're going to be able to conclude that process?
Okay, so in terms of HMRC, I mean, that's something we're working closely with HMRC on. I'm talking regularly to John Thompson about. I want to make sure I update the committee on the very latest position, so why don't I write to you to give you an update?
And on the general move into the
general
regional hubs, when the exercise you're undertaking with the Cabinet Office, when do you expect to complete that?
Well, we're doing it on a case-by-case basis, to be honest. So different hubs come on stream at different stages. So at the point when the Cabinet Office are bringing those hubs through, that has to link into what we're trying to do more broadly with our estate programme, which is slightly further advanced because our 20-year contract came to an end on Easter Saturday at the end of March. Every time the Cabinet Office are ready to make an announcement, we are able to talk about our involvement in that. But broadly speaking, for our staff, they know where they stand for the moment for many, many offices all around the country.
So I still didn't think I quite got an answer to my question. When do you expect that process to be complete?
Well, I suppose the point I'm making is that we have now moved away from a 20-year contract with all of our buildings. So instead of being locked into a certain number of buildings for 20 years, we now have much, much more flexibility. So in a sense, the answer to your question is we will never finally be settled, because all the time we'll need to be actively reviewing our estate as lease breaks come up. So many of the leases we've recently signed have lease breaks in 2023. There'll be a process of work around running up to those lease breaks to decide where we want to be going forward. It needs to link to what we need in terms of the nature of the scale of our operation and the number of people we need over the long term.
Is that a rather long-winded answer of saying that eventually all your people will operate out of the government hubs? And if that's the case, what does that say about locally delivered services?
No, sorry, it's not at all. The nature of our operation is one where we need to be locally based. Of course, with job centres, they need to be locally based. We have the opportunity in some parts of the country to bring together some of our back office functions into larger hubs. Treforest is an example of that in South Wales. But we have a different strategy from HMRC, for example, on that, because we need to be locally based, particularly for job centres.
Which is interesting, because HMRC tell us that part of the reason they're doing this is because it's a government policy to have government hubs. So the back office stuff, places like Morpeth and Benton.
Okay, but the nature of we have a retail estate in terms of
I think we
recognise
that. Job centre pluses need to be where people are, but you have Benton, you have Morpeth, you have places where you have large tracts of stuff. Are you saying categorically today you're not going to move those into these hubs, these 13 hubs?
Some of them we will, but not all of them.
And are you taking into account the economic impact in there? If you took the DWP staff out of Morpeth, it would, or more than decimate, the town would never be the same again. It transformed the town.
I understand that. And so I was actively involved in the decision around Treforest in my old job as Finance Director General. And we looked at the financial implications, and we looked at the economic implications. We spent a lot of time talking to the Welsh government as well in terms of where we should be. Treforest has much better access to many of our existing staff who commute from the valleys. And it's a much better location to recruit and retain the people we want to recruit and retain than the central.
And there's no pressure from the Cabinet Office to make you move into the hubs?
You can imagine we had a conversation about that, but we weighed...
The answer is yes, there is. Okay, right.
But we weighed up considerations in the way that I described, and we did that. I had lots of conversations with
That's
John
very interesting, because only today I was talking to some HMRC staff who were telling me that 73 people in one of their offices will have to take redundancy because they can't, because of caring responsibilities, travel to the new centre. So we're heartened by what we've heard of your approach, but given this is a public hearing, we may hear some evidence from people, and we'll write to you if we do. Now, just a couple of very quick points. On posthumous payments for ESA staff, Ms Haddad, is there a time limit on when that money can be paid to the estate? What happens if you find a next of kin, but not for some time? Will there be a time limit on when those payments can be made to the deceased's estate?
I don't think so.
No. So it could go on for. So there will be provision in the DWP budget for all of these claimants, even if you can't yet trace their members of.
And in the same way as any claimant who's not deceased, if we can't contact them and through several attempts, but they come forward in the future, we'll pay them.
Okay, right. That's good to know. And earlier we heard about we were in discussion about PIP. the idea of assessment reports being available to claimants. Is this something that's potentially on the cards, Mr Schofield? Mr Wolfe?
So we've recently responded to the Working Pension Select Committee on the improvements that we're going to make to PIP, and I think our focus is on recording at the moment, which I know is something that the Select Committee and other reviewers have been very
no,
keen
is what
on.
you're saying?
No, I mean we've talked to a lot of claimants, and there's not a huge demand from claimants themselves for this, and they can request it if they want to receive it.
So they can request it. Okay. So if I were having a PIP assessment, I could ask for a copy, like I'd ask for my health records or something.
Yeah,
that's possible.
yes.
And you get the actual document that someone's written down on the assessment document.
I'd have to check on exactly what
you want to double check.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I would like. I think that's quite useful to know if that's the case. But I'm not sure. That's not my experience. But then I only have a handful of cases relative to your total. And then on the PIP assessments, why are so many appeals now being lost? It's gone up, hasn't it, quite substantially, Mr Schofield? You're new in the job. Have you been looking at this?
Yes. I think the Secretary of State, or was it the Minister for Disabled People, referred to the numbers in the orals and topicals only this afternoon. I think we're still on 9% of cases come to appeal and 4% are overturned on appeal. And it's around the same, it's about 8% and 4% in ESA. I think that's right. Mr Wolfe, James has got the numbers right in front of him, but yeah.
Continues to pursue this. So, can I thank you very much indeed for your time. The transcript, as ever, will be up on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. And welcome to the Public Accounts Committee as Permanent Secretary. We look forward to seeing you often. Really? Well, you say that now. We're obviously giving you a soft ride this afternoon. Thank you very much.
The proceeding has ended.